In the climate-controlled basement of the Louvre Museum, beneath galleries where tourists photograph paintings, there exists a room most visitors never see. The air here tastes different, cooler, drier, regulated to preserve what lies within glass cases along walls that stretch into shadow. Clay cylinders, thousands of years old, covered in wedge-shaped marks pressed into wet earth before the pharaohs built their pyramids. One cylinder in particular, you could hold it in both hands if they'd let you. Terracotta, the colour of dried blood, 30 centimetres tall, the surface dense with cuneiform script, each character no larger than a grain of rice. The museum catalogue lists it simply Gudea cylinders A and B, circa 2100 BCE, excavated from Tello, ancient Gursu, in what is now southern Iraq. But the words inscribed on this clay, the actual translation, describe something that shouldn't be possible. A transfer of power, not metaphorical power, not authority granted through coronation or conquest. The text describes divine energy moving from one being to another, transferred, measured, controlled. The Sumerian term appears over and over in the inscription Me, usually translated as divine decree or divine power, but the context suggests something far more specific, something that could be possessed, stolen, stored in a location, given away, lost. The cylinder tells how the god Ningirsu gave these Emi to Gudea, the ruler of Lagash, how Gudea then used them to construct a temple, not with slave labor and bronze tools alone, but with something else, something the text calls the artful divine powers. The language describes them flowing through the structure, activating the building, making it alive. If you read the translation carefully, really carefully, you start to notice details that don't fit the usual religious narrative. The text doesn't speak in vague metaphors about divine blessing. It uses specific procedural language, transfer protocols, storage locations, activation sequences. This is not how gods are supposed to work, and this cylinder is not alone. Across museum collections, archaeological sites, and university archives, dozens of Sumerian texts describe these Emi in similar terms, physical terms, energy terms. They speak of a power source, the Anunnaki, the Sumerian gods, controlled absolutely, a power they transferred among themselves according to strict protocols, a power they occasionally granted to humans but never fully, a power that was stolen repeatedly by those who wanted it. The texts call this power forbidden, not because it was evil, but because it was restricted, guarded, monopolized. What if the Sumerians weren't speaking symbolically? What if these clay tablets, pressed with reed styluses in the 3rd millennium before Christ, preserve the memory of an actual energy source, one that fueled a civilization we've categorized as primitive, but which might have understood forces we're only beginning to rediscover? Take a moment, if you're listening to this at night, to leave a comment about where you are in the world. This investigation will take time. The evidence is old. The translations are complex, the implications are uncomfortable, but the tablets themselves are real. The words are there, and they tell a story about power, actual, measurable, transferable power that someone very much wanted humanity to forget. Let's begin where the Sumerians themselves began, with a word, the language of power. The Sumerian language died, not gradually through evolution into daughter tongues, but completely. By the time Alexander the Great conquered Babylon in 331 BCE, no one had spoken Sumerian as a living language for nearly 2,000 years. The cuneiform script survived longer, used by Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians to write their own Semitic languages. But the original Sumerian, the tongue of the first cities, the first written laws, the first libraries, vanished into clay tablets buried under Mesopotamian sand. When archaeologists began excavating sites like Nippur, and Uruk in the mid-1800s, they unearthed thousands of these tablets. They recognized the script as cuneiform, but they couldn't read it. The language was a linguistic isolate, unrelated to any known language family. No Rosetta Stone existed to bridge the gap. The decipherment took decades. Scholars like Henry Rawlinson, Edward Hincks, and Jules Oppert worked from Akkadian bilingual texts tablets that provided the same content in both Akkadian and Sumerian. Slowly, painfully, they reconstructed the grammar, the vocabulary, the syntax. By the early 20th century, Sumerologists could read the tablets. What they read changed everything we thought we knew about the origin of civilization. Among the tens of thousands of administrative records, legal codes, and economic documents, they found literary texts, epic poems, temple hymns, cosmological accounts. And running through these texts, appearing in context after context, they encountered a term that defied easy translation, ME. The word is deceptively simple. Two cuneiform signs, CAW, pronounced May in Sumerian, but its meaning proved maddeningly complex. Early translators rendered it as divine powers or divine decrees. Some called it divine ordinances. Others used cosmic principles or divine attributes. Samuel Noah Kramer, one of the 20th century's foremost Sumerologists, struggled with the term throughout his career. In his 1963 work, The Sumerians, he wrote that ME represented the fundamental, unalterable, comprehensive assortment of powers and duties, norms and standards, rules and regulations relating to civilized life. That's a lot of meaning for one word. But here's what makes ME truly strange. The Sumerian texts don't treat it as an abstraction. They treat it as something concrete, something that can be counted, listed, transferred from one person to another, stolen, hidden, and weaponized. Consider the text catalogued as ETCSL1. 1. In the Electronic Text, Corpus of Sumerian Literature at Oxford University. The story is known as Inanna and Enki. The goddess Inanna travels to the Abzu, the underground freshwater ocean where the god Enki lives. Enki, wise and powerful, possesses the ME, all of them. The text says he guards them in his temple. Inanna and Enki drink beer together. Date beer, the text specifies. Fermented in bronze, agar vessels. They get drunk. Genuinely drunk. The text describes Enki becoming increasingly intoxicated. His speech becomes loose, his judgment impaired. And then, in his drunken state, Enki begins giving Inanna the ME, not all at once. The text describes 7 distinct transfers. After each gift, Enki drinks more, becomes drunker, and gives Inanna another batch. The language is transactional, specific. He presented her with the first ME, the text says, then the second, then the third. Each time Inanna accepts them and loads them into her boat. When Enki sobers up, he realizes what he's done. He's given away the ME. He sends his minister, Izimud, to stop Inanna and retrieve them. But Inanna escapes with the ME and brings them to her city, Uruk. The text describes her arrival as a great victory. She has brought divine power to her people. This is not how metaphors behave. Abstract concepts, justice, wisdom, compassion, cannot be loaded into boats. They cannot be stolen while someone is drunk. They cannot be counted and divided into 7 portions. You cannot send messengers to retrieve them before they leave your territory. But the text treats the ME exactly this way, as objects, or perhaps more accurately, as a substance, something that can be contained, transported, and transferred. The same pattern appears in other texts. In the Epic of Anzu, preserved on tablets in the British Museum's collection, including ME 124371, a divine stormbird named Anzu steals the Tablet of Destinies from the god Enlil. This tablet is described as the ultimate ME, the source of supreme power. With it, Enlil controls the fates of gods and men. When Anzu takes it, Enlil becomes powerless. The tablet isn't symbolic. It's functional. Without it, Enlil cannot act. The other gods must send the warrior Ninurta to retrieve it, not because of honor or justice, but because cosmic order has literally stopped functioning. The tablet had to be recovered because power itself had been stolen. In the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic that draws heavily from earlier Sumerian sources, the young god Marduk rises to supremacy by acquiring the Tablet of Destinies after defeating Tiamat. He doesn't earn authority through birthright or virtue. He takes possession of an object that grants authority. The text specifies that he inscribes fate on the tablet. He uses it. It's a tool. What were the Sumerians describing? Mainstream scholarship interprets ME as a theological construct. The Sumerians, lacking our modern understanding of natural law and social order, personified these concepts as divine powers. The Me represented civilization itself, agriculture, writing, law, kingship, warfare, all the elements that separated Sumerian cities from the surrounding tribes. When texts describe gods transferring Me, scholars argue they're describing the transmission of cultural knowledge, mythology as metaphor for historical processes. This interpretation is reasonable, safe. It fits our understanding of Bronze Age cultures as superstitious, pre-scientific peoples who explained everything through divine action, but it requires ignoring the specificity of the language. The Oxford Electronic Text Corpus preserves a complete list of the Me that Enki gave to Inanna. There are over 100 items. Some are abstract, godship, kingship, truth. These fit the metaphorical interpretation, but others are oddly specific and physical. The art of metalworking, the craft of the leatherworker, the art of building, lighting fire, extinguishing fire. These aren't philosophical concepts. They're skills, techniques, procedures. And some are stranger still. Descent into the underworld. Ascent from the underworld, the kindling of strife, the setting up of lamentations, rejoicing of the heart. These Me describe actions, capabilities, things one can do with this power. The text says Enki possessed these capabilities and could transfer them to others, not teach them, transfer them. Inanna couldn't metalwork before. After receiving that Me, she could, or rather, her city could. The power itself moved from Enki's possession to hers. In tablet CBS 1063, held in the University of Pennsylvania Museum's Babylonian collection from the Nippur excavations, a temple hymn describes the Absu, Enki's shrine in Eridu, as the place where pure food is eaten, watered by the prince's pure canal, mountain, pure place cleansed with the potash plant. Abzu, your tigi drums belong to the divine powers. The text explicitly states that the divine powers, the Me, belonged to that location. They were stored there, physically present in some form. Other texts describe Me as being worn by gods. Inanna, in particular, is frequently described as wearing Me as ornaments. The Exaltation of Inanna, written by the priestess Enheduanna around 2300 BCE, described the goddess adorned with the Me, not crowned with authority, not blessed with power, adorned with them, as if they were physical objects. Sumerian art depicts gods and goddesses wearing elaborate headdresses, pectorals, and garments covered in symbols. Could these represent the Me? Were they actual devices, energy conductors? The texts never say explicitly, but the consistent use of physical language suggests they might be. The cuneiform sign for Me itself offers a clue. The symbol U is a compound logogram. In its earliest form, from around 30,000 BCE, it appears to represent something tied or bound together, multiple elements connected. The sign evolved over centuries, but this core meaning, multiplicity, connection, binding, remained. If we take the Sumerians at their word, Me were composite forces, not a single energy, but a spectrum. Each type of Me enabled specific capabilities. Together, they constituted what we might call a complete technological base. Control over Me meant control over civilization itself. This raises an uncomfortable question. If the Me were actual, measurable forces, what was their nature? The texts offer hints. Me are consistently associated with specific locations. The Abzu beneath Eridu, the Ekur temple in Nippur, the Yana temple in Uruk. They're stored. They flow through structures. They can be anchored to places or carried in containers. This suggests they're not purely electromagnetic or thermal. They seem to be something that interacts with physical space in specific ways. They're also transferable between beings, suggesting they can be absorbed, held within living bodies, and released. Enki held them, Inanna received them, Marduk claimed them. Each god who possessed Me could wield them according to their nature, but humans couldn't, not fully. The texts are clear on this point. Humans could use Me indirectly through temples, rituals, kingship, but never possessed them absolutely. Only the Anunnaki, the great gods held Emi in their entirety. This restriction appears deliberate, protective, as if giving humans full access to Emi would be dangerous. Why? The answer might lie in what happened when humans got too close to this power, when they built structures that channeled it, when they attempted to reach heaven. But to understand that, we need to go to where the Emi were first stored, to the oldest city, to the temple at the edge of the world, where the boundaries between water and land, between divine and human, between ancient and modern, dissolve into something the Sumerians called the Abzu Vault. Tel Abu Sharain sits in southern Iraq, about 20 kilometers from the modern town of Nasiriyah. From a distance, it looks like most Iraqi archaeological mounds, a low hill of packed earth and broken brick, surrounded by empty desert. No tourists come here, no reconstructed walls or informational plaques, just wind, sand, and the occasional researcher with permits from Baghdad. But beneath this unremarkable mound lies something extraordinary, the oldest continuously inhabited temple site in human history. The Sumerians called this place Eridu. According to their own records, it was the first city. Not the largest, not the most powerful, but first, the place where civilization began, where kingship descended from heaven, where the gods first established their dwelling among humans. The first excavations began in 1854, when British geologist John George Taylor dug into the mound on behalf of the British Museum. He uncovered inscribed bricks that identified the site as Eridu, Temple City of Enki. But it wasn't until extensive Iraqi excavations between 1946 and 1949, led by Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd, that archaeologists understood what they'd found. 18 temple levels, stacked one atop another like a stratigraphic layer cake of devotion. The lowest level, temple, I dated to approximately 5000 BCE, before writing, before the wheel, before the Sumerians even existed as a distinct culture. Someone had built a shrine here when the world was young, and then, for 3000 years, they rebuilt it in the same spot, again and again. Each time the structure collapsed or was deliberately demolished, the next generation built a new temple directly on top. Same location, same orientation, same purpose. By the time Temple 18 was constructed around 2500 BCE, during the period when Gudea ruled nearby Lagash, the accumulated holiness of the spot had raised the temple platform high above the surrounding plain. The final structure was massive, a ziggurat, mud brick faced with fired brick, dedicated to Enki, god of fresh water, wisdom, and, according to the texts, possessor of the Me. The temple was called Abzu, the house of the Abzu. The Abzu itself requires explanation. In Sumerian cosmology, the Abzu was the underground ocean of fresh water that fed all springs, rivers, and wells. Not a mythological concept, but an actual hydrological system, the water table, the aquifer. The Sumerians, living in the marshy lands between the Tigris and Euphrates, understood that fresh water came from below. They dug wells that confirmed it. In their worldview, this underground ocean was Enki's domain. But the texts describe the Abzu as more than just water. The Sumerian temple hymn preserved in ETCSL 481, part of a collection attributed to the priestess Enheduanna, describes the Abzu in language that's both geological and mystical. Abzu, shrine erected for its prince. Idu Kug, house which is the holy mound, where pure food is eaten, watered by the prince's pure canal. Mountain, pure place, cleansed with the potash plant. Abzu, your Tiji drums belong to the divine powers. The hymn calls the temple a mountain, though Eridu sits on flat alluvial plain. It describes the place as pure, cleansed repeatedly, and it states explicitly that the divine powers, the Me, belong to this location. Another hymn from the same collection is even more specific. Abzu, life of the land, beloved of Enki, temple built on the edge, befitting the artful divine powers. Eridug, your shadow extends over the midst of the sea. The temple is described as built on the edge. Edge of what? The land, the water, or something else. The text says its shadow extends over the midst of the sea, not into the sea, over it, as if the structure projected influence beyond its physical footprint. These descriptions suggest the temple functioned as something more than a house of worship. The language implies a facility, a storage site, a place where the Emi were housed and, perhaps, accessed. The archaeological evidence supports this interpretation in unexpected ways. When Saffer and Lloyd excavated Temple 1, the earliest structure from 5400 BCE, they found a simple rectangular room approximately 4 by 5 meters. In the center of the room was a raised platform. In one corner, a stepped altar. In another corner, a table for offering. The layout is elementary, basic, yet the builders chose to construct this room at this specific location and maintain it for 3 millennia. Why? Later temples became more elaborate. Temple 7, from around 4500 BCE, included multiple chambers, a central sanctuary, and evidence of complex architectural planning. By Temple 5/5, around 2100 BCE, the structure had grown to include subsidiary shrines, storage rooms, and what appear to be processional corridors. But here's what's strange. In every temple level, archaeologists found the same artifact pattern. Near the central altar, consistently, they discovered hundreds of fish bones, not human food waste. These were offerings, fish brought from the marshes and left before the god. Why fish? Because Enki's symbol was the goatfish, because his domain was the fresh water where fish lived, because, in some fundamental way, fish represented the power Enki controlled, but mixed with the fish bones, archaeologists found something else. Bitumen, natural asphalt that seeps from underground petroleum deposits common in southern Iraq. The Sumerians used bitumen as waterproofing, as mortar, as a trade commodity, but at Eridu it appears in ritual contexts, deliberately placed, offered. The texts describe Enki dwelling in the Abzu beneath his temple. This wasn't metaphorical. The Sumerians believed Enki lived in the underground waters, in chambers beneath the earth, in a realm that mirrored the temple above. The physical temple at Eridu was a gateway, a connection point. In the text, Enki and Inanna, when Inanna travels to steal the Emi, she doesn't simply walk into Enki's temple, she descends. The text describes her journey as going down into the Abzu to where Enki dwells with his treasures. When she escapes, she ascends back to the surface world and loads the Emi into her boat. This imagery descent to obtain power, ascent with it, appears throughout Sumerian literature. The Abzu wasn't on the surface. It was below, hidden, protected by depth and water, and, perhaps, by something else. The temple hymns describe the Abzu as having artful divine powers. The Sumerian term is tua, mi, galam. Galam means skillful, artful, sophisticated. The text isn't saying the temple was blessed by simple divine favor. It's saying the divine powers present there were sophisticated, complex, refined. What does it mean for power to be artful? In Enki and the World Order text, ETCSL 1.1.3, Enki travels across the known world distributing Emi to various regions and cities. He doesn't distribute them equally. Each place receives Emi appropriate to its nature. Sumer receives agriculture and irrigation. Foreign lands receive different powers. The text describes this as Enki assigning destinies and fixing fates, but the language is administrative, bureaucratic. He's allocating resources. From his base in Eridu, in the Abzu temple, Enki manages a power grid. That's not hyperbole. The texts describe a distribution system. The Emi are stored centrally in the Abzu and parceled out according to need and hierarchy. Temples in other cities receive certain Emi. Kings are granted temporary access to specific Emi during their reigns. Craftsmen can channel Emi related to their trades through proper ritual, but the full spectrum remains with Enki, or it did, until Inanna stole them. The story of that theft, as recorded in multiple tablet fragments from Nippur, including CBS 4561 and CBS 7847 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum, reveals something crucial about how the Emi functioned. Enki didn't simply hand them over. According to the text, Inanna had to receive them 7 times. 7 distinct transfers. After each transfer, she had to accept them. The text uses a specific verb, mutu ti, meaning to receive into one's hand, to take possession. Each time Enki gave Emi, Inanna had to actively accept them before they became hers. This suggests a protocol, a procedure. Energy doesn't transfer itself. There must be both a source and a receiver, both willing to complete the exchange. Even drunk, Enki had to consciously give. Even determined to steal them, Inanna had to formally receive them. Once transferred, the Emi were described as being in her possession. She had them. Not copies, not blessings, the actual powers themselves, which meant Enki no longer had them. When he sobered up and realized what he'd done, he tried to get them back, not because his pride was hurt, but because the powers were gone. His ability to function depended on having them. This is not how divine omnipotence works in later religious traditions. The Christian God doesn't lose power when he grants blessings. Allah doesn't become weaker when believers pray. But Enki, holding the Emi in the Abzu beneath Eridu, could lose them. They could be taken, and if taken, he was diminished. The Sumerians understood their gods as powerful, but not omnipotent. The gods ate, they slept, they got drunk, they made mistakes. And most importantly, their power came from something external to themselves. The Emi existed before the gods claimed them, or, at least, before these particular gods claimed them. Where did the Emi come from originally? The texts don't say. The king list, preserved on the Weld Blundell Prism in the Ashmolean Museum, Oxford, states that kingship descended from heaven after the flood. Before the flood, kings ruled for impossibly long periods. After the flood, kingship had to be restored, handed down from above. But who handed it down? Who possessed the Emi before Enki stored them in the Abzu? The texts fall silent on this point. Or rather, they push the answer back beyond memory. When kingship descended from heaven, the Me came from heaven, from before, from the time when the Anunnaki themselves were young. Which raises the question, if the gods received the Me from somewhere else, from some earlier source, then the Me aren't divine by nature. They're just power, neutral, usable by whoever possesses them. And if that's true, then the entire divine hierarchy isn't based on inherent superiority. It's based on control of an energy source, access to the Abzu, possession of the Me. That's what made Enki a god. Without them, he was just a being who could get drunk and make terrible mistakes. The drunken god and the theft. The great god, Enki, wise and terrible, master of the subterranean waters and keeper of all sacred powers, sits in his temple drinking beer with a beautiful young goddess. This is not how the story should begin. Gods in later mythologies don't get intoxicated. Yahweh doesn't binge drink. Zeus might seduce and deceive, but he does so from a position of total control. Even when Greek gods show weakness, it's theatrical weakness, staged for narrative purposes, never genuinely compromising their power. But the Sumerians told different stories about their gods. The text preserved as ETCSL 1.3.1, copied and recopied by scribes across 1,000 years, describes what happened when Inanna, goddess of love and war, came to visit Enki in Eridu. Multiple tablet fragments preserve versions of this story, including specimens from Nippur now housed in the University of Pennsylvania Museum. The narrative consistency across these fragments suggests this wasn't a fringe myth. It was important, repeated, taught in scribal schools. The story begins simply. Inanna decides to visit the Abzu. The text doesn't explain why initially. She just goes. She travels from her city of Uruk down to Eridu, down to the edge of the world where Enki dwells. Enki sees her coming. He's pleased. He calls to his minister Isimud and says, "Come, my minister, my sweet name of heaven, my good minister of the Iabzu." The maiden Inanna has approached the Iabzu all by herself. Let date wine be brought out for her. Let beer be brought out for her in the face of the lion. The face of the lion is a specific type of ceremonial vessel, bronze, shaped with leonine features. These vessels exist in archaeological collections. The British Museum has several examples from the period. They weren't everyday drinking containers, they were ritual objects used in important ceremonies. So Enki isn't just offering Inanna a casual drink, he's initiating a formal event. A feast, a ceremony of hospitality between divine powers. The text continues, Enki and Inanna were drinking beer together in the Abzu and enjoying the taste of sweet wine. The bronze Ugga vessels were filled to the brim. The bronze containers of Urash, the mother of the earth, were filled to overflowing. They drink together, beer and wine, from sacred vessels filled to overflow. The scene is convivial, intimate, two gods sharing intoxicants in a private space. And then Enki begins giving away the ME. The text is explicit about what happens next. After drinking, Enki says to Inanna, in the name of my power, in the name of my Abzu, I will give them to holy Inanna, my daughter. He presents her with the first set of ME. The text lists them: high priesthood, godship, the noble and enduring crown, the throne of kingship. Inanna accepts them. She says, I take them. They drink more. Enki becomes more intoxicated. He gives her a second set: truth, descent into the underworld and ascent from it, the art of lovemaking, the kissing of the phallus. Again, Inanna accepts. This pattern repeats 7 times. Each time, Enki drinks more, becomes drunker, and gives away another batch of ME. The categories become increasingly varied. Some are abstract powers, victory, counselorship, judgment. Others are practical skills, metalworking, leatherwork, construction. Some are social functions, the setting up of lamentations, rejoicing of the heart. In total, the text lists over 100 specific ME transferred from Enki to Inanna. By the end, Enki is thoroughly drunk. The text describes him as senseless, unable to think clearly. Inanna, meanwhile, has maintained enough sobriety to carefully load all the ME into her boat of heaven and prepare to leave. When Enki wakes up, he realizes what he's done. His response isn't anger at betrayal, it's panic. He turns to Isimud and says, my minister, my sweet name of heaven, where are the divine powers of the Abzu? Isimud responds, my king has presented them all to his daughter Inanna. Enki's reaction is immediate and desperate. He sends Isimud to stop Inanna. Follow her quickly. She must not bring them to Uruk. The divine powers must return to the Abzu. This is where the story becomes revealing. Enki sends a series of monsters and demons to stop Inanna and retrieve the ME. First, the Enkum creatures, then the Ugalu demons, then other supernatural beings, each more powerful than the last. Inanna defeats them all with help from her minister, Ninuba. The battles are described in formulaic language. Each creature confronts Inanna at a different way station between Eridu and Uruk. Each time, Inanna invokes the ME she's already received, specifically invoking their power to overcome the attack. The creatures cannot defeat her because she now possesses the very powers they serve. Eventually, Inanna reaches Uruk with the full cargo of ME intact. She unloads them. She distributes them throughout her city. The text describes this as a great triumph. Uruk becomes the center of civilization because Inanna has brought the ME from Enki's Abzu to her own temple. Enki doesn't get them back. The story ends with Inanna victorious, Enki diminished, and the ME permanently relocated from Eridu to Uruk. Mainstream Sumerologists interpret this myth as a political allegory. Uruk, in the late 4th millennium BCE, rose to prominence as Eridu declined. The story of Inanna stealing the ME from Enki represents this historical shift. Uruk's priesthood composed the myth to legitimize their city's newfound dominance. The ME symbolize cultural and political authority transferred from an older center to a newer one. This interpretation is historically sound. Cities did rise and fall. Political power did shift. Myths often encode these transitions in divine narratives, but that reading doesn't account for the specific details of how the transfer occurred. Enki doesn't willingly abdicate. He's tricked. Inanna doesn't conquer him in battle or win a contest of wisdom. She gets him drunk and takes advantage of his impaired state to extract the ME from him through what amounts to a con job. Why would Uruk's priesthood tell the story this way? If the point was to establish Uruk's superiority over Eridu, why not compose a myth where Inanna defeats Enki in honest combat? Why not have Anu, the Sky Father, decree that the ME should move to Uruk? Why construct a narrative where the city's patron goddess obtains power through deception and theft? Unless the story wasn't entirely invented, unless it preserved some memory of an actual event. Not necessarily Inanna getting Enki drunk, but the ME genuinely transferring from one location to another through an irregular procedure. The text's attention to procedural detail suggests something real underlies the narrative. Notice how the transfer happens 7 times. 7 distinct exchanges, each requiring Enki to give and Inanna to accept. Even drunk, Enki must consciously authorize each transfer. The ME don't simply disappear from the Abzu, they're methodically removed through repeated transactions. This resembles a technical procedure more than a theft. Like someone with password access downloading files from a secure server, the security protocols still function. Enki must authenticate each transfer, but his judgment is compromised, so he authorizes downloads he would normally refuse. After the transfer, Enki cannot retrieve the ME by force. He sends servants, demons, and monsters, but none can take the ME back from Inanna. Once she possesses them, they're hers. The power has moved. Ownership has changed. Enki might regret the transaction, but he can't reverse it unilaterally. This is not how magic works in fantasy literature. Magical artifacts can usually be stolen back. Spells can be countered, but the ME, once properly transferred according to protocol, cannot be reclaimed by the original owner. They've genuinely moved from one possessor to another. This behavior is more consistent with physical resources than supernatural powers. If you give someone gold, they have the gold. You no longer have it. You can try to take it back by force, but the gold itself doesn't care who owns it. It just exists, neutral, possessed by whoever holds it. The ME seem to function the same way. They're not extensions of Enki's divine will. They're something he possesses, something that can be separated from him, something that, once lost, diminishes his functional power. The list of ME that Inanna receives is equally telling. These aren't vague spiritual qualities. Many are specific technical capabilities, the art of metalworking. Not the blessing of metalworkers, but the art itself. The knowledge, the ability, the craft of the carpenter. Again, not patronage, but the actual skill set. The kindling of fire and the extinguishing of fire, listed as separate ME, as if starting fire and stopping fire required different powers. Descent into the underworld and ascent from the underworld, also separate. 2 different capabilities, both needed for the complete round trip. Some ME are social, the setting up of lamentations, rejoicing of the heart, the art of song. These might seem purely cultural, but notice, they're not emotions themselves. They're the capacity to create emotions, to perform actions that evoke feelings in others. Technical skills for affecting human consciousness. Other ME are political, kingship, enmity, victory, counsel, judgment. The power to establish authority, to create conflict, to win wars, to advise, to make binding decisions. Again, these are capabilities, functions one can perform if one possesses the relevant ME. When Inanna brings these ME to Uruk, the text describes her city flourishing in all these domains. Uruk's metalworkers excel, its carpenters build magnificent structures. Its kings rule justly, its musicians create beautiful songs. Not because Inanna blesses these activities, but because she's brought the actual powers that enable them. The city gains capability it didn't have before. This is technology transfer, not divine favor, but the movement of functional knowledge and power from one site to another. If we take the text seriously, if we assume the Sumerians were describing something real in the only language they had, then the ME were a transferable energy source or information matrix that enabled specific capability. Enki possessed this source in the Abzu, beneath Eridu. Inanna found a way to extract it from him. Once she possessed it, she could do things she couldn't do before, and Uruk, through her, gained capacities that transformed it into a great city. The drunkenness isn't just a narrative device, it's the vulnerability point. Whatever security measures protected the ME, whatever protocol normally prevented unauthorized transfer, Enki's intoxication compromised it. Like a security guard asleep at his post, like a locked vault with the combination written down and left visible. The ME were protected under normal circumstances, but that protection wasn't automatic. It depended on the vigilance and good judgment of whoever controlled them, and for one night in the Abzu beneath Eridu, vigilance failed. The ME left their sanctuary, power flowed from one deity to another, and the city of Uruk rose to greatness on the strength of what its goddess had stolen. But what exactly had she stolen? What were these ME when you listed them out, counted them, examined them individually? That list survives, and it's stranger than anyone expected. The inventory of reality. The complete list exists, pressed into clay tablets excavated from Nippur, translated by generations of scholars, and now preserved in digital form in the electronic text Corpus of Sumerian Literature at Oxford University. 105 specific ME that Enki gave to Inanna during their night of drinking in the Abzu. To read this list carefully is to experience cognitive dissonance. Some items seem like theological abstractions. Others read like operational capabilities. Some are incomprehensible. And some sound like technologies described by people who don't understand how they work. Let's go through them. Not all 105, that would exhaust both patience and space, but enough to establish the pattern. The first batch Enki gives to Inanna includes high priesthood, godship, the noble and enduring crown, the throne of kingship. These are hierarchical positions, not abstract ideas like justice or mercy, but actual offices. Priesthood, godship, kingship. The ME don't represent these concepts. They are these positions. To possess this set of ME means to possess the legitimate authority to occupy these roles. Already, we're beyond metaphor. Enki isn't blessing Inanna's future career prospects. He's giving her the actual capacity to function as priest, god, and king. The crown and throne are listed specifically because they're part of the package. Symbols, yes, but symbols that work. That confer authority because they carry the ME that makes authority real. The second batch, truth, descent into the underworld, ascent from the underworld, the art of love-making, kissing of the phallus, the art of prostitution. This grouping is bizarre. Truth appears alongside sexual practices and the specific capability to travel to and from the underworld. Why are these bundled together? What logic connects epistemological certainty with underworld travel and sacred sexuality? Unless the list isn't organized thematically, unless these ME simply happen to be what Enki gave in the second round of transfers, grouped not by category, but by the order in which he handed them over. Like emptying your pockets, what comes out depends on what's in there, not on any particular system. The third batch, the holy shrine, the holy temple, the lustration rites, the priestly office, lofty station, the office of minister, truth, the art of speaking. Now we're back to religious infrastructure, shrines, temples, purification rituals, and various priestly functions. But notice, truth appears again. It appeared in the second batch. Is this a scribal error, a repeated entry, or are there multiple kinds of truth, each a separate ME? The text doesn't explain. Fourth batch. The libation, the exalted shrine, the cult prostitute, the religious festival, the shrine, music, the art of the singer, eldership. Music appears as an ME, not inspiration for music, not the blessing of musicians, but music itself, the capability to produce organized sound. The art of the singer is separate, suggesting there's a distinction between music as general phenomenon and singing as specific technique. Both must be possessed for vocal music to exist. Fifth batch, the art of power, treachery, the rebel land, goodness, justice. Here, Abstract qualities appear alongside operational capabilities. The art of power suggests power itself can be wielded artfully, that there's a technique to its use. Treachery is listed as if it's a tool, a method that can be possessed and deployed. The rebel land is particularly strange. It's not rebellion itself, but the land of rebellion, as if certain territories are defined by their relationship to central authority, and that relationship is encoded in an ME. Sixth batch. The rejoicing of the heart, falsehood, the troubled heart, the kindling of fire, the extinguishing of fire, weariness. Emotional states appear as ME, but not emotions themselves, the causing of emotions. Rejoicing of the heart means the power to make hearts rejoice. The troubled heart means the power to create trouble in hearts. These are effects one can produce in others if one possesses the relevant ME. Kindling of fire and extinguishing of fire are separate items. Starting fire requires one ME. Stopping fire requires a different one. They're not opposites of the same power. They're distinct capabilities. Weariness appears on its own. The power to make tired. The ability to exhaust. Why is this important enough to list? Seventh and final batch. The craft of the carpenter, the craft of the coppersmith, the craft of the scribe, the craft of the smith, the craft of the leather worker, the craft of the fuller, building, destruction. Now we get to practical technologies. Carpentry, metalworking, writing, smithing, leatherworking, textile processing. These are the core industrial arts of Bronze Age civilization. Each is an ME. Each must be possessed for the craft to function. The list ends with building and destruction as separate items. Construction and demolition, creation and dismantling. Two sides of the same process, listed as distinct powers. That's just the ME explicitly described in the 7 transfers. The full text of Inanna and Enki includes an even longer list in other sections, reaching 105 total items. Some of the additional ME include the giving of judgments, making decisions, the laying on of hands in religious offerings, the writing of words, the giving of orders, respect, awe, the revered silence, bitter lamentation, raising of hands in appeal, cult prostitution, the offering of prayers, the mighty knife and board, the measuring rod and line in temple building, the construction of dwellings, the lighting of fires, the extinguishing of fires, hard work, the assembled family, procreation, allure, forthright speech, slanderous speech, adorning speech, the cult prostitute, the holy tavern, weapons, the devouring of the prey, herding, the stall, the fold, dwelling places, deceit, the rebel land, kindness, being on the move and about, being settled in a dwelling place, the craft of the metal caster, the craft of the jeweler, the craft of the stone cutter, the scribe's craft, the craft of the basket weaver. The pattern that emerges is comprehensive. The ME cover every aspect of Sumerian civilization: religion, politics, economics, military affairs, construction, metallurgy, agriculture, sexuality, emotional manipulation, family structure, hospitality, trade, deception, and rebellion. If it existed in Sumerian society, there was an ME for it. This is remarkably similar to what we might call a complete technology base. Not just tools, but the knowledge of how to make and use tools. Not just buildings, but the architectural principles that allow building. Not just social order, but the psychological and political techniques that maintain order. Imagine trying to explain modern technology to someone from a pre-industrial culture. You talk about electricity, but you might not be able to explain electrons and electromagnetic fields. You'd demonstrate a light bulb, and they might conclude that lighting is a power you possess. They'd see you turn the light on and off and might catalogue those as separate powers. The kindling of light and the extinguishing of light. They'd watch you build a machine and might list all the separate crafts involved: metalworking, precise measurement, assembly, ignition. Each would seem like a distinct power because they couldn't see the underlying principles connecting them. Like a catalogue compiled by observers who could see what the technology did but didn't understand how it worked. They knew metalworking was different from carpentry. They knew starting fire was different from putting it out. They knew building required different power than destroying. So they listed each observable capability as a separate ME. But if all these ME came from a single source, from Enki's repository in the Abzu, then maybe they weren't actually separate. Maybe they were all expressions of one underlying energy or knowledge matrix, refracted into 105 distinct applications, like electricity powering 100 different devices. The current is one thing, the devices are many. Someone cataloguing them might list the power of lighting, the power of heating, the power of motion, the power of communication, not realizing it's all the same, electricity channeled through different machines. The Sumerians listed ME the same way. Each observable effect got its own name, but the source was singular. The Abzu, Enki's repository, the underground sanctuary where all power was stored. Which raises the crucial question, if these ME were that comprehensive, if they encompassed every aspect of civilization, then who created them? The texts never say the ME were created. They simply existed. The gods possessed them, fought over them, transferred them, but never made them. The ME seem to be older than the gods themselves, or at least older than this generation of gods. Because there's another text, another story that complicates everything. A story about how power was stolen not from Enki by Inanna, but from Enlil, king of the gods, by a creature that should never have been able to touch divine power at all. The story of the Tablet of Destiny, the story of Anzu, the tablet that controls fate. In the British Museum's catalogue system, object ME 124571 doesn't look like much. Fragment of a clay tablet, about 8 centimeters tall, reddish-brown clay inscribed with Akkadian cuneiform, part of a larger tablet that was broken centuries ago with only this section surviving. But the story preserved on this fragment is extraordinary. It's part of the Epic of Anzu, a Babylonian myth with older Sumerian roots that describes the theft of the Tablet of Destinies from Enlil, the supreme god of the Mesopotamian pantheon. The tablet itself appears in multiple myths across 1,000 years of Mesopotamian literature. Sometimes it's called Tablet of Destinies, sometimes Tablet of Fates. In Sumerian, it's the dub Namtara. In Akkadian, Yupka Matu. The artifact is consistently described the same way, a clay tablet inscribed with cuneiform writing and impressed with cylinder seals. But this wasn't an ordinary tablet. Possession of the Tablet of Destinies granted absolute authority over the universe. With it, gods could decree fate and control the course of events. Without it, even the most powerful deity became helpless. The Tablet of Destinies was, in effect, the ultimate ME, the master key, the root password to reality itself. And according to the Epic of Anzu, it was stolen by a monster. Anzu, also called Indugud in earlier Sumerian texts, was a divine storm bird, half lion, half eagle, massive, powerful. In Sumerian art, Anzu appears on cylinder seals and relief sculptures, usually depicted with a lion's head, eagle's wings and talons, and a body somewhere between feline and avian. The creature symbolized the storm winds of southern Mesopotamia, powerful, dangerous, and difficult to control. In earlier Sumerian myths, Anzu was sometimes benevolent. The hero Lugal Banda, in one cycle of legends, befriends an Anzu chick and receives blessings from the parent bird. But by the Babylonian period, Anzu had become darker, more dangerous, less controllable. The Epic of Anzu begins with Enlil, king of the gods, dwelling in his temple Ekur in the city of Nippur. Enlil possessed the Tablet of Destiny. The text specifies that he wore it as a pectoral, a chest ornament suspended from his neck. This wasn't decorative. The tablet needed to be on his person, against his body, constantly maintained in contact with him. Why? What would happen if he took it off? The text suggests that the tablet's power flowed through the wearer. Without physical contact, the connection was broken. Power ceased. Enlil entrusted Anzu with serving him. The bird beast acted as a guardian, stationed at the entrance to Enlil's chamber. Anzu watched Enlil perform the daily rituals of kingship, and as Anzu watched, the creature began to covet the tablet. The text describes Anzu's thoughts. I shall take the divine tablet of destinies for myself, and I shall govern the totality of all the gods. I shall establish my throne and be master of the decrees. I shall govern the totality of all the Ijiji gods. Notice the language. Anzu doesn't want honor or worship or love. Anzu wants to govern and be master of the decrees. The tablet isn't symbolic authority. It's functional power. Whoever possesses it controls the decrees that govern reality. The Ijiji gods, the younger generation of deities who serve the senior Anunnaki, would have to obey whoever held the tablet. Anzu waits for the right moment. Enlil performs his morning ablutions. He removes the tablet of destinies and sets it aside while he bathes. In that instant of vulnerability, Anzu strikes. The bird snatches the tablet and flees. The text describes cosmic disaster immediately ensuing. The divine rules were stripped away, the Anuship was removed. The sanctuaries became dark, the religious rites were cancelled, the divine powers fell silent. This is not metaphorical darkness. The text describes actual cessation of function. The divine rules stopped operating. The Anuship, the kingship of heaven, was removed, not just challenged. The sanctuaries went dark. The rituals could not be performed. The gods themselves fell silent, because the tablet was gone. Without it, divine power didn't just diminish, it stopped. Like unplugging a machine, the gods could no longer act. They retained consciousness and awareness, but their ability to affect reality had been severed. Enlil cannot pursue Anzu himself. Without the tablet, he's powerless. He calls an assembly of the gods and begs for someone to retrieve it. But the gods are terrified. The text describes their fear explicitly. Whoever possesses the tablet controls them. To fight Anzu now is to fight the master of fate itself. Finally, the warrior god Ninurta volunteers, but he doesn't go alone. He requires special weapons, divine assistance, and explicit instructions from Ea, the Akkadian name for Enki. The text describes Ea advising Ninurta on how to defeat Anzu. Strike him at the pinion joint of his wings. When he hears the sound of his own wings, fear will enter his heart. The battle is described in detail. Ninurta shoots arrows, but Anzu uses the tablet's power to turn the arrows back in mid-air. Every weapon Ninurta deploys, Anzu counters by speaking commands that alter reality. The bird beast has learned to use the tablet, at least partially, enough to defend himself against divine assault. But Anzu isn't fully competent with the tablet. He's stolen it, yes, but he doesn't understand it completely. The power is there, but his mastery is incomplete. Ninurta exploits this. Following Ea's advice, he targets Anzu's wings. When the creature's flight is compromised, his concentration breaks. His control over the tablet falters. In that moment, Ninurta strikes the killing blow. Anzu falls. Ninurta retrieves the tablet of destinies and returns it to Enlil. The text describes restoration. The Anuship returned to Enlil. The divine rules were established again. The sanctuaries were restored. Light returned. Reality reboots. The gods can act again. Order returns. This story appears in multiple versions across Mesopotamian history. The earliest Sumerian fragments date to around 2000 BCE. Later Akkadian versions were copied and recopied well into the first millennium BCE. The narrative core remains consistent. A powerful being steals the ultimate source of divine power. Cosmic order collapses. A hero must retrieve the power and order is restored. It's a myth. Obviously a myth. Gods don't exist. Monster birds don't steal tablets that control fate. But what if the myth encodes a memory of something real? What if there actually was a device, a tablet, an artifact, a mechanism that granted authority over some system, and that device was lost, causing systematic failure until it was recovered? The behavior described in the text doesn't match how we usually think of divine power. Divine power in most religious traditions is intrinsic. God is omnipotent by nature, not because he possesses an artifact. Removing a physical object from God doesn't diminish him. But the Tablet of Destinies works exactly like a physical device. It must be worn constantly. It can be physically stolen. It stops working for the original owner once removed. The thief can learn to use it. The thief's mastery is imperfect at first. The device can be recovered and returned, at which point functionality is restored to the original owner. This is how we talk about technology, about passwords and access keys, about control systems that grant authority to whoever possesses them. The Tablet of Destinies functions less like divine providence and more like an administrative access device. And it's not the only such artifact in Mesopotamian mythology. In the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, the young god Marduk defeats the primordial goddess Tiamat and seizes the Tablet of Destinies from her. The text specifies that Kingu, Tiamat's consort, wore the tablet during the battle. After Marduk's victory, he takes the tablet, seals it with his own seal, and wears it himself. This transfer of the tablet represents the transfer of cosmic kingship from the old gods to the new. But notice, the tablet isn't created by Marduk. It already existed. Tiamat had it. Kingu wore it. Marduk took it. The tablet predates the current divine order. It's older than the gods who fight over it. Who made it? The texts never say. The tablet simply exists. It's a given, part of the initial conditions of the cosmos. Like the ME stored in Enki's Abzu, the Tablet of Destiny seems to be foundational, not created by the gods, but possessed by, fought over, transferred from one power to another as history unfolds. This suggests something extraordinary. The ME, including the Tablet of Destinies, represent a pre-existing technology or energy source that the Anunnaki themselves discovered or inherited. They didn't create civilization's power base. They found it, claimed it, monopolized it, and occasionally lost it. The pattern repeats. Enki possesses the ME, Inanna steals them, Enlil possesses the tablet, Anzu steals it. The power is always centralized in divine hands, but it's vulnerable. It can be taken, and when it's taken, even the greatest gods become powerless. This vulnerability suggests the divine hierarchy wasn't natural. It was maintained through control of specific resources. The gods were powerful because they monopolized the ME. If humans gained access to these powers, the hierarchy would collapse, which might explain why the gods worked so hard to keep humans at a distance, why temples were closed to all but priests, why the ME were stored underground in the Abzu, not distributed freely, why the Tablet of Destinies had to be worn constantly by the King of Heaven. The power had to be protected, controlled. Because if it fell into the wrong hands, human hands perhaps, the age of gods would end. But there's another dimension to this story. Another realm where power flowed differently, where the rules changed, where even gods could die, the underworld, Ker, the land of no return, where Ereshkigal ruled absolutely, and not even Inanna could break her power. Before the flood came the well. Blundell Prism sits in a climate-controlled case in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford University. Four-sided, clay, about 20 centimeters tall, covered entirely in cuneiform script arranged in neat columns. The inscription wraps around all four faces, requiring you to rotate the prism to read the complete text. Herbert Weld Blundell purchased it in 1922 from a dealer in Baghdad. The prism had been excavated, legally or otherwise, from somewhere in southern Iraq. Its exact provenance is uncertain, but linguistic analysis dates it to the Old Babylonian period around 2000 BCE, though it copies an earlier Sumerian composition. The text inscribed on this prism is called the Sumerian King List. It begins with a statement that should be impossible. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. In Eridu, Alulim became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. 28,800 years. For one king, one reign. The text continues with the second king of Eridu. Al-Jah ruled for 36,000 years. Then the kingship moved to Bad Tibira. 5 kings ruled there. Their combined reigns total 108,000 years. Then to Larag, 1 king, 28,800 years. then to Zimbir, 1 king, 28,000 alge years, then to Shuruppak, 1 king, 36,000 years. The king list records 8 kings before the flood. Their total combined reign, 241 years. Then comes the line that changes everything. The flood swept over. After the flood had swept over and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. After the flood, kingship had to descend from heaven again, as if the previous divine order had been wiped away and needed to be reconstituted. But now, the reign lengths changed dramatically. The first king of Kish after the flood ruled for 1,200 years, still impossibly long by modern human standards, but a fraction of the antediluvian reigns. As the king list progresses through post-flood dynasties, the reign lengths gradually decrease. By the time it reaches historically verified kings, rulers whose existence and approximate dates are confirmed by archaeological evidence, the numbers become realistic. Sargon of Akkad ruled for 56 years. The kings of Ur III ruled for periods of 9 to 48 years. The king list presents a descending curve from impossible to plausible to confirmed. Mainstream scholarship interprets the antediluvian section as pure mythology. The numbers are symbolic, representing the great antiquity and divine nature of the earliest kings. No human being could rule for 28,800 years. Therefore, these figures aren't historical. They're theological statements about the sacred origins of kingship, wrapped in numerical metaphor. This interpretation is reasonable. The numbers are clearly impossible by any biological standard. Humans don't live that long. They didn't in 2000 BCE. They certainly didn't in whatever actual prehistoric period the king list tries to describe. But here's what's strange. The text treats all the kings the same way. It uses identical grammatical structures for antediluvian and post-flood rulers. The format is consistent throughout. City name, king name, became king, he ruled for number, years. The antediluvian kings aren't described differently. They're not called gods or demigods. They're listed exactly like later human kings, just with vastly longer reigns. If the Sumerians intended these figures as pure symbolism, why not use special language to distinguish mythic time from historical time? Why present the information in the same documentary format used for verified historical rulers? Multiple versions of the king list survive. The Weld Blundell prism is just the most complete. Fragments have been found at Nippur, Lhasa, Ur, and other sites. All versions include the antediluvian section with impossibly long reigns. The numbers vary slightly between versions, but the basic pattern holds. Before the flood, kings ruled for tens of thousands of years. After the flood, reign lengths decreased dramatically, but remained superhuman for several generations before gradually approaching normal human lifespans. This creates a specific narrative. Something about the pre-flood world allowed for extremely long reigns. The flood changed this. Post-flood kings lived longer than modern humans, but nowhere near antediluvian standards. Over time, this longevity decreased further until reaching normal human ranges. What could cause this pattern? If we apply the framework we've been developing, that the ME represented an actual energy source or technology controlled by the Anunnaki, then the king list might record the effects of differential access to this power. The antediluvian kings ruled when the ME were fully available, when Enki's Abzu in Eridu functioned at maximum capacity, when the Tablet of Destinies channeled power without interruption. Under these conditions, the texts suggest, human lifespans extended dramatically, not because biology changed, but because exposure to the ME altered aging processes. Several Sumerian texts describe the ME as including life itself. In the list, Inanna stole from Enki. Life appears as a specific ME, not metaphorical spiritual life, but actual biological vitality, the power to sustain living organisms beyond their normal parameters. If the antediluvian kings had greater access to this life-sustaining power through proximity to Eridu, through ritual contact with the Abzu, through technologies or procedures now lost, their extended reigns become less impossible, not biologically normal, but technologically enhanced. Then the flood came. The Sumerian flood story appears in multiple texts, including the Eridu Genesis and the fuller Atrahasis epic. The narrative is consistent. The gods decided to destroy humanity through a massive flood. But one god, Enki, always Enki, warned a faithful human named Ziausudra, or Atrahasis, or Utnapishtim in later Akkadian versions. This human built a boat, survived the flood, and repopulated the earth afterward. The story is famous because it parallels the biblical flood narrative, but the Sumerian version includes details the biblical account omits. In the Atrahasis epic, preserved on tablets in the British Museum, including BM 78941, the gods send the flood because humanity has become too numerous and too noisy. The text literally says humans are disturbing the gods' sleep. But beneath this surface reason, something else is implied. Humanity is approaching divine power, growing, too capable, too independent. The god's solution is to reset civilization, wipe it out, start over with tighter controls. After the flood, the gods reconstitute human society, but with new limitations. The Atrahasis epic specifies that the gods create infertility, stillbirth, and priestesses who don't bear children. These aren't curses, they're population control measures. Humanity is allowed to continue, but in reduced numbers, with built-in biological limits, and according to the king list, with reduced lifespans. Post-flood kings still lived longer than modern humans. 1,200 years, 900 years, 600 years, but they were no longer approaching the tens of thousands of years recorded before the flood. Something had changed in the relationship between humanity and the power source the ME represented. Perhaps the flood destroyed the infrastructure that channeled this power. Perhaps the temples were swept away, the Abzu sanctuaries damaged, the connection points severed. The Eridu Genesis mentions that temples had to be rebuilt after the waters receded. If these temples were more than religious buildings, if they were actual facilities that channeled energy from underground sources, then their destruction would explain the sudden decrease in human longevity. Or perhaps the gods deliberately limited human access to the ME after seeing how powerful humanity had become. The king list says kingship descended from heaven twice, once before the flood, once after. This suggests a deliberate re-establishment of the system under new parameters. The gods gave kingship again, but with restrictions. Less power, shorter lifespans, greater divine control. The gradual decrease in reign lengths over subsequent generations could represent humanity drifting further from the power source. Each generation, the residual effects of the ME diminish. By the time the king list reaches historically verified periods, around 2000 BCE, with the first dynasty of lifespans had normalized to 50 to 80 years. The power hadn't disappeared entirely. The temples still functioned. Kings still performed rituals. The ME still existed in their Abzu repositories, but human access was regulated, mediated, controlled by priestly hierarchies who determined when and how much divine power would flow to humanity. This interpretation treats the king list as a scientific document recording an actual phenomenon, the effects of variable access to a longevity technology. The numbers are accurate within the framework of what the technology could accomplish. The decline is gradual because the technology degraded slowly over generations, not all at once. Modern biology offers potential parallels. We now know that telomere length affects cellular aging, that certain genes control senescence, that caloric restriction extends lifespan in many organisms. That exposure to various environmental factors can accelerate or slow aging processes. If the ME represented some form of energy or information that interacted with human biology at the genetic or cellular level, extended lifespans become theoretically possible. The Sumerians wouldn't have understood it in these terms. They had no concept of DNA or cellular biology. They would have observed the effects, people living much longer when properly connected to divine power, and recorded them in the only framework they had, Kingship descended from heaven, sustained by divine favor, declining as that favor withdrew. But here's the disturbing implication. If the antediluvian kings really did live for tens of thousands of years through technological enhancement, then those kings would have accumulated vast knowledge, experience, power. A king who ruled for 28,800 years would have personally witnessed the entire rise of Sumerian civilization, would have learned, adapted, grown in capability across centuries. Such beings would be godlike in their knowledge and power, even if biologically human, and according to the king list, the flood killed them all. When the waters receded, only Yasuda remained. One man, one family. Whatever knowledge the antediluvian kings possessed, whatever mastery of the ME they'd achieved, died with them. The post-flood world had to rebuild from scratch. Kingship descended from heaven again, but the continuity was broken. The new kings, even with extended lifespans, couldn't match the accumulated wisdom of their antediluvian predecessors, unless that wisdom was somehow preserved, stored, encoded. Which brings us to the strangest aspect of the king list. It exists at all. Someone in the Old Babylonian period, around 2000 BCE, compiled this document. They gathered information about pre-flood kings from sources already ancient in their time. They listed impossible reign lengths without explanation or apology. They preserved this information in a form intended to last. Why? If the numbers are pure fiction, why record them in the same format as verified historical data? Why create a continuous chronology from impossible antiquity to documented present? Unless the compilers believed it was true. Not symbolically true, actually true. They had records, texts, king lists, temple archives that claimed these figures, and they faithfully copied them into a master chronology, preserving the impossibility for future generations to puzzle over. That document sits in Oxford now, clay pressed with reed stylus 4,000 years ago. The kings it names never walked the earth as we understand earthly existence, but the text remains, the numbers remain, and somewhere in those numbers might be encoded the memory of a time when humans lived differently, when power flowed more freely, when the boundary between mortal and immortal was measured not in biology but in access to the ME, before the flood swept it all away. The blood and clay formula. The British Museum catalogue entry for BM 789441 identifies it as part of the Atrahasis epic, Old Babylonian period, approximately 1700 BCE, excavated from Sippar in southern Iraq. The tablet preserves one of humanity's oldest creation stories, the account of how the gods made human beings. The story begins with a problem. The gods are exhausted. For years, the text says 3600 years, which is 6060, a sacred number in Mesopotamian mathematics. The lower gods, called Ijiji, have performed all the labor. They dig irrigation canals. They dredge rivers. They maintain agricultural systems. The work is backbreaking, endless, and the Ijiji are God. They weren't designed for manual labor. Finally, they rebel. They burn their tools. They march on Enlil's temple. They threaten revolution. Enlil, king of the gods, doesn't know what to do. He calls an assembly. Anu, the Sky Father, is present. Enki, wise as always, offers a solution. Let one of their brothers be given up. Let him be slain so that people can be created. Let the great gods be present at the assembly. Let one god be slain so that they may be absolved. Note the language. A god must be slain, not an animal sacrifice, not symbolic death. An actual deity must die so that humans can be created from his body. The gods agree. They choose Ilu, also called Geshtui in some versions, a god who participated in the Ijiji rebellion. The text describes him as having intelligence, or in Akkadian, Mu. This word means more than cleverness. It means rational thought, understanding, consciousness. The gods slaughter. Ilu, they perform the execution ritually, in assembly with all the great gods watching. Then comes the procedure described in the text. Nintu mixed clay with his flesh and blood. They heard the heartbeat of the god in the clay. Read that again slowly. Nintu, the birth goddess, also called Ninhursag or Mami in other texts, takes clay and mixes it with the flesh and blood of the slaughtered god, and in the resulting mixture, they hear his heartbeat. The god's consciousness, his mu, his vital force, is now in the clay. The text continues, "In the clay, God and man were mixed together," not metaphorically. The text uses concrete, procedural language. Mix clay with divine flesh, add divine blood. The result contains both material substance and divine essence. God and human combined in the mixture. From this hybrid material, Nintu forms the first humans. The text says she creates 14 pieces, 7 male, 7 female. She calls the birth goddesses to assist her. Each goddess receives a piece of the god-clay mixture and shapes it into human form. Then comes a 9-month gestation period. The text specifies this precisely, 9 months. Exactly the human pregnancy term, as if the birth goddesses incubated these clay-flesh hybrids in their own bodies until they matured into living humans. At the end of 9 months, the first humans emerged. The text describes them as immediately capable of labor. They could speak, understand commands, and perform the agricultural and construction work the Igigi had refused to do. The god's problem was solved. The Igigi were freed from labor. Humans took over the work, and the divine hierarchy was preserved. But notice what this story reveals about human nature. In Sumerian theology, humans aren't created from nothing. They're not spoken into existence by divine command. They're engineered, constructed from a specific formula, clay, material substance, plus divine flesh and blood, which carries mu, consciousness. The process required a sacrifice. A god had to die to provide the necessary ingredient. His flesh and blood contained something essential, something that couldn't be substituted with animal material or plant matter. It had to be divine substance. This is not how later creation myths work. In Genesis, God forms Adam from dust and breathes life into him. The life force comes from God's breath, not from God's flesh. God doesn't have to die or sacrifice part of himself. He simply gives life by will. But in the Sumerian account, life transfer requires physical substance. The god's Immu was in his blood. To transfer that Nimu to the clay, the blood had to be mixed in. The resulting humans contained actual divine material in their composition. Other versions of this creation story appear in various Mesopotamian texts. The common elements are consistent. Humans were created to serve the gods. The creation required mixing clay with divine blood. A god was sacrificed to provide the blood. The resulting humans possessed a measure of divine consciousness. Humans could work, think, and reproduce. This last point is crucial. The text specifies that humans were made to reproduce themselves. The gods didn't have to keep manufacturing humans. Once the initial 14 were made, they could produce more through biological reproduction. The divine essence somehow became heritable, passed from generation to generation through normal birth. This suggests that whatever the divine blood contained, the consciousness, the God element, was compatible with biological heredity. It could be transmitted genetically. Once introduced into the clay flesh matrix, it became a permanent part of human nature. The Atrahasis epic includes another detail that complicates this picture. After the first humans were created and had multiplied across the earth, the text says they became too noisy. They disturbed the gods. But the word used isn't just noise. The Akkadian term rigmu means tumult, uproar, but also assembly and discourse. Humans weren't just loud, they were organizing, communicating, thinking collectively. The divine mu in their composition was working. Consciousness was producing civilization. The gods became alarmed. First, they sent plague to reduce the population. Humans survived. Then drought. Humans adapted. Then famine. Humans persisted. Finally, the gods decided on total annihilation, the flood. But why such extreme measures? If humans were created to serve the gods, why destroy them? Unless humans were becoming too much like gods. The Numa in their blood was expressing itself in ways the Anunnaki hadn't anticipated. Humans weren't just laboring. They were thinking, building, organizing, approaching divine capabilities. The mixture had been too effective. When Enki warned Ziusudra about the coming flood, He wasn't just saving his favorite human out of sentimentality, he was preserving his creation. The experiment had succeeded too well, and the other gods wanted to terminate it. But Enki, who had designed the formula, who had directed the mixing of clay and divine blood, wanted humanity to continue. After the flood, the gods reconstituted human society under tighter controls. The Atrahasis text specifies new biological limitations, reduced fertility, infant mortality, celibate priestesses. These measures would prevent human population from growing too large, too powerful again. But the fundamental formula remained. Humans still carried divine blood, still possessed Chi-Mu, still had the potential for godlike consciousness. This is why the ME had to be controlled so carefully. If humans who already possessed a measure of divine essence in their very biology gained full access to the ME, they would become equals to the gods, not metaphorically. Actually, they would wield the same powers, possess the same capabilities, threaten the divine monopoly on reality control. The gods couldn't unmake what Nintu had made. The divine blood was in humanity's composition, inherited generation after generation, but they could restrict access to the technologies and power sources that would allow that divine spark to fully manifest. Keep humans laboring, keep them busy with survival, let them build cities and civilizations, but always under divine supervision. Never let them access the Abzu directly. Never let them hold the Tablet of Destinies. Never give them the complete ME, because humans weren't a separate creation. They were hybrids, part clay, part God. The potential was already there. It just had to be suppressed or awakened. The cosmic distribution, the text catalogued as ETCSL 113 in the electronic text. Corpus of Sumerian literature is called Enki and the World Order. It's a long composition over 450 lines preserved on multiple tablets from Nippur and Ur. The poem describes Enki traveling across the known world, systematically distributing divine powers to different regions, cities and domains. It reads like an administrative document wrapped in liturgical language. The text begins with Enki praising himself in his temple, the Abzu in Eridu. He lists his titles and powers. He describes how Enlil gave him authority over the Abzu, the sweet waters, the foundations of the earth. He speaks of the ME in his possession, using the phrase artful divine powers repeatedly. Then he begins his tour. First stop, Sumer. Enki blesses the land with agricultural abundance. He assigns specific ME to Suma. The great divine powers are perfected. Suma, the great mountain, the universe's divine powers, the noble divine powers. The language is formulaic, but the meaning is clear. Suma received the core set of civilizational ME, agriculture, architecture, law, kingship, everything needed for advanced society. Next, Yer, the city. Enki assigns it specific powers related to building and prosperity. The text describes how Ur's foundations are made firm, how its borders are established, how its people are given abundant food. Then Meluha, a foreign land across the sea, probably the Indus Valley. Enki gives Meluha different powers. The black wood, the carnelian, the good thing brought from the mountains. Trade goods, exotic materials, the power to produce items Suma needs but cannot make. Then Dilmun, probably Bahrain. Enki assigns it power over sea trade, describing how ships will dock there, how goods will flow through its harbours. The pattern continues. Enki visits Elam, Mahashi, Martu, the Tigris, the Euphrates, the sea, the rain, agricultural fields and numerous other locations. At each stop, he speaks a decree that assigns specific ME to that place. This isn't blessing in the general religious sense. This is resource allocation. Each region receives capabilities appropriate to its geography and role in the larger system. Sumer gets agriculture because it has fertile alluvial soil. Meluha gets exotic woods and stones because its mountains produce them. Dilmun gets trade powers because it's positioned between Sumer and distant lands. Enki is configuring a network. Each node receives specific functions. Together, they form an integrated system that channels resources, goods, and knowledge across the known world. But here's what's significant. The ME don't originate in these places. They're assigned from elsewhere, from Enki, from the Abzu. The text makes this explicit. Enki travels and speaks decrees that activate powers in each location. Before his visit, those powers were dormant or absent. After his decree, they function. This suggests the ME weren't natural properties of locations. They were imposed, activated by someone with central authority. Enki, who possessed the master set in the Abzu and could deploy specific subsets to other locations, like a computer network. The central server holds all the data and processing power. Client machines receive specific capabilities pushed from the server. They can't function beyond their assigned parameters unless the central authority grants them more access. The world order Enki establishes is hierarchical and centralized. Power flows from the Abzu outward. Enki sits at the center, controlling distribution. Other gods receive authority over specific domains. Ninlil over grain, Ninmug over metalworking, Nanshi over fish and birds, but always as delegated power granted by Enki from his central repository. The text includes a fascinating episode where Inanna complains that she hasn't received enough ME. She approaches Enki and protests, "He has assigned divine powers to other deities, but not to me. Enki has assigned divine powers to Ninurta, to Nisaba, to all the others. What about me?" Enki responds by listing powers Inanna already possesses. The list is extensive: battle, warfare, strife, the festival, love, council, and many others. But Inanna isn't satisfied. She wants more. The text portrays her as constantly seeking additional ME, trying to expand her domain. This dynamic reveals something important. The ME weren't unlimited. There was a finite set. Distribution was a zero-sum game. If one deity received more ME, others had less. Inanna's complaint makes sense. If the ME represented actual power capacity that could be divided and allocated, not abstract blessings that could be given infinite. Enki's role as distributor made him essential to the divine hierarchy. The other gods depended on him for their functional powers. This explains why he's portrayed as so important despite not being the official king of the gods. That title belonged to Enlil. Enki controlled the infrastructure. Enlil had authority, but Enki had access. The text also describes Enki establishing the physical infrastructure of civilization, irrigation systems, boundaries between lands, marshes, fisheries, stalls for cattle, sheepfolds for sheep. Each is assigned a deity to oversee it, but Enki is the one who sets up the system. This is administrative thinking, bureaucratic organization. The cosmos isn't ruled by divine whim, but by structured allocation of responsibilities and resources. Each god has a job. Each location has a function. Everything fits into the larger order Enki has designed. But what happens if the center fails? If the Abzu is damaged? If Enki loses the ME, as he nearly did to Inanna, the entire system would collapse. Each node would cease to function properly because the power distribution would stop. The cities wouldn't generate their assigned capabilities. The regions wouldn't produce their designated goods. The divine hierarchy itself would destabilize because the gods derived their authority from the ME they possessed. This vulnerability is precisely why the gods guarded the Abzu so carefully, why Enki dwelt there personally, why the temple in Eridu was maintained for 3,000 years. The Abzu wasn't just a religious site, it was mission control. The text, Enki and the World Order, ends with a long passage where Enki praises the Abzu temple and describes its perfection. He lists its properties. It's pure, holy, firmly founded, connected to the sweet waters, adorned with lapis lazuli, filled with divine powers. The temple is described almost as a living thing, active and powerful in itself. This suggests the temple functioned as more than a container for power. It might have been part of the power generation or channeling system. The architecture itself, the specific design, the materials, the location over aquifers could have been essential to the ME's function. Which brings us to the most dramatic expression of this architectural principle, the ziggurats. Massive stepped pyramids that dominated Mesopotamian cities. Structures so massive they're still visible as ruins 4,000 years after their construction. Mountains built by human hands, reaching toward heaven, mountains that reached heaven. The ziggurat of Ur rises from the desert like a geometric hallucination. Even in its current partially reconstructed state work done in the 1980s by Saddam Hussein's government, it dominates the landscape. 3 massive tiers of mud brick faced with fired brick. Steep staircases converging on the upper platform, 70 meters long, 60 meters wide, 30 meters high in its original form. It was built around 2000 BCE by King Ur-Nammu of the 3rd dynasty of Ur, dedicated to Nana, the moon god. At its summit stood a temple, much smaller than the platform beneath it, the shrine where, according to Sumerian belief, the god dwelt. Everything about the structure is excessive. You don't need a 30-meter high platform to hold a small temple. You could build the temple at ground level, but the Sumerians didn't. They invested enormous resources, thousands of tons of brick, years of labor, massive quantities of bitumen for waterproofing, to lift the temple high above the surrounding city. Why? The standard archaeological interpretation is symbolic. The ziggurat represented a mountain. In Sumerian theology, the gods dwelt on mountains, but southern Mesopotamia is flat alluvial plain. No mountains exist for hundreds of kilometers, so the Sumerians built artificial mountains, creating the elevated sacred space where gods could descend from heaven to interact with humanity. This interpretation explains the motivation, but not the specific design. If the goal was simply to create an elevated platform, there are more efficient ways to do it. But ziggurats have a very particular form. Stepped levels, usually 3 or 7 tiers, connected by external staircases with the temple at the summit. This isn't just a mountain, it's a structured ascent, a pathway from ground level to divine space, mediated through architectural stages. The ziggurat of Ur had 3 tiers. Other ziggurats had 7, including the Enuma in Babylon, the structure that probably inspired the biblical Tower of Babel story. Each level was painted a different color. Black bitumen at the base, red brick in the middle, white plaster at the top. The temple at the summit was covered in blue glazed tile, earth, blood, light, sky. The color progression encoded a cosmological journey from material realm to divine realm, but the architecture suggests the ziggurats were more than symbolic. Several features indicate they might have served functional purposes we don't fully understand. First, water systems. Excavations at Ur revealed that the ziggurat's core included drainage channels. The structure wasn't solid brick. It contained voids, channels, systems for moving water through the interior. Why would a solid monument need internal plumbing? The excavators, led by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s, proposed that these channels prevented water damage. Mesopotamia's water table is high. Without drainage, water would seep into the brick core and cause structural failure. So the builders incorporated drainage from the beginning. This explanation works at the engineering level, but it assumes the water was a problem to be solved, not an intentional feature. Given that ziggurats were dedicated to gods, Nana at Ur, Enlil at Nippur, Inanna at Uruk, Enki at Eridu, and given that the Abzu, the subterranean water source, was Enki's domain, perhaps the water wasn't incidental. Perhaps the ziggurats were designed to channel water from the aquifer upward through the structure, to create a connection between the underground waters, the Abzu, and the temple at the summit. Second, bitumen. Enormous quantities of natural asphalt were used in ziggurat construction, far more than needed for simple waterproofing. Bitumen was applied in thick layers between brick courses, creating a distinctive striped pattern in the masonry. At Ur, archaeologists found bitumen layers 15 centimeters thick in some sections. Bitumen is a hydrocarbon. It comes from geological processes that produce oil. It's chemically complex, containing hundreds of organic compounds. In modern terms, it's a petroleum product. The Sumerians called it ezir, and they used it for many purposes: waterproofing boats, sealing jars, binding bricks, even as medicine. But why use so much in sacred architecture? One possibility: bitumen is slightly conductive. Not like metal, but it has measurable electrical properties, especially when mixed with other minerals. If the Me involved some form of electromagnetic energy, and this is pure speculation, then bitumen layers in the ziggurat structure might have served as insulation or channeling material. Third, orientation. Ziggurats are precisely aligned to cardinal directions. The ziggurat of Ur's corners point almost exactly north, south, east, and west, with an error of less than 1 degree. This precision required sophisticated surveying and astronomical observation. Why does a religious monument need precision alignment? Medieval cathedrals were built with attention to orientation, yes, but not to this degree of accuracy. The builders of ziggurats were solving a technical problem that required astronomical precision. Fourth, architectural proportions. The dimensions of ziggurats follow mathematical ratios. The relationship between base width, platform height, and staircase angle isn't arbitrary. Different ziggurats use similar proportional systems, suggesting a shared design template. These weren't one-off constructions. They followed specifications. Fifth, restricted access. The temples atop ziggurats were closed to the public. Only priests could ascend. Only the high priest could enter the summit shrine. Common people could see the ziggurat. It dominated the city, but couldn't access it. This restriction makes sense if the ziggurat was primarily symbolic. Sacred spaces are often restricted, but it also makes sense if the structure served a technical function that required trained operators. If climbing the ziggurat involved specific procedures, rituals that had to be performed correctly at each level, then unrestricted access would be dangerous. The Sumerian temple hymns describe the act of ascending ziggurats in detailed language. The climb isn't simply walking upstairs. It involves purification at each level, specific prayers, offerings at designated points. The ascent is gradual, structured, initiatory. By the time the priest reaches the summit, he's been transformed through the process. He's moved from the profane ground level to the sacred height. He's ready to enter the god's presence. Or, in more technical terms, he's been progressively attuned to higher frequencies of the divine power. Each level of ascent brings him closer to the concentrated ME at the summit. The rituals at each stage prepare his consciousness to withstand the full intensity of the divine presence. Herodotus, the Greek historian who visited Babylon in the 5th century BCE, described the Etemenanki ziggurat in his Histories. He reported that the summit temple contained a large bed and a golden table. No statue of the god, just furniture. The priests told him that the god Marduk would sometimes descend to this chamber and rest there. A priestess would stay in the temple waiting for the god to arrive. Herodotus was skeptical, but his description is interesting. The temple contained no crowd, no congregation, no public ceremony, just a chamber with a bed where god and priestess could meet in private, an interface point, a place where divine and human could interact directly. What actually happened in these summit temples? We have very few texts describing the rituals. What survives is mostly public liturgy hymns sung in courtyards, processions around the base, offerings presented at lower levels. The summit rituals were private, restricted, possibly secret, but one Sumerian text provides a clue. The Gudea cylinders, those same inscriptions in the Louvre that describe divine power transfer, include a lengthy account of temple construction. Gudea builds a temple for the god Ningirsu. The text describes the materials, the labor, the design, and it describes what happened when the temple was completed. On that day, the divine powers became manifest in the house filled with divine radiance. A fearful aura covered it. The house was like a mountain of pure lapis lazuli. The temple, once completed and consecrated, became active. The divine powers became manifest. They appeared, became observable, filled the space. The building glowed. It emanated an aura that inspired fear. It looked like a mountain of lapis lazuli, a deep blue stone associated with the heavens. This doesn't sound like metaphor. It sounds like a system activating, like power flowing through a structure designed to channel it, like a machine starting up. And if the ziggurats were machines, energy channeling systems, consciousness amplifiers, communication arrays linking earth to heaven, and the Abzu beneath to the gods above, then their destruction would have catastrophic effects. The ziggurats fell. Time, weather, warfare, and neglect reduced them to ruins. The temples at their summits collapsed first, their mud brick dissolving in rain. The staircases eroded. The brick faces crumble. By the time Greek and Roman travelers visited Mesopotamia, the ziggurats were already ancient ruins, their purposes forgotten. The power they channeled, if they channeled power, ceased flowing. The network Enki had established, connecting cities to the Abzu through architectural nodes, was severed. The age of direct divine presence ended. The gods stopped descending to earth. The ME became inaccessible, or perhaps they were simply dormant, waiting in the Abzu, waiting in underground chambers beneath ruined ziggurats, waiting for someone to restore the system. The gates of Ker. There are places the gods feared to go. The Mesopotamian underworld, called Ker in Sumerian, Ikala in Akkadian, was one such place, not because it was evil. Sumerian theology didn't frame reality in terms of cosmic good and evil, but because the rules there were different. Inverted, absolute. The living world operated under the authority of the sky gods, Anu, Enlil, and their court. The Abzu, though beneath the earth, still belonged to Enki and connected to the surface through waters and temples. But Ker was separate, sealed, a realm from which nothing returned. Ereshkigal ruled there. The earliest Sumerian texts describe her as the only deity who dwelt permanently in the underworld, not by choice. She'd been taken there, either abducted by the primordial dragon Ker or assigned the role by the elder gods. The texts vary, but once she became queen of the dead, she remained there forever. She couldn't leave. Even gods couldn't escape Ker's gravity. Her power in that realm was absolute. The most famous text describing the underworld's power is Inanna's Descent to the Netherworld, preserved on multiple tablets including copies at Yale and the University of Pennsylvania. The story tells how Inanna, goddess of love and war, decided to visit the underworld. The text never explains why clearly. She claims she wants to attend funeral rites for Gugalana, the bull of heaven, Ereshkigal's husband, but the real reason seems to be conquest. Inanna wants to extend her authority into Kur. She prepares carefully. She adorns herself with all her her crown, her necklaces, her breastplate, her ring, her lapis measuring rod and line, her pala dress, her wig. Each item represents specific powers she possesses. She tells her minister Ninshubur to raise alarm and seek help from the gods if she doesn't return in 3 days. Then she descends. The underworld has 7 gates. At each gate, a gatekeeper demands that Inanna remove one of her divine powers. She protests, but the gatekeeper invokes the ways of the underworld, which are perfect and cannot be changed. Inanna cannot enter unless she strips away her ME one by one. At the first gate, she removes her crown. At the second, her lapis beads. At the third, her breastplate. Gate by gate, level by level, she descends deeper into Ker, becoming less divine with each passage. By the time she reaches the 7th gate and enters Ereshkigal's throne room, she's naked, powerless. Just a being with consciousness, but no authority, no protection, no divinity. Ereshkigal doesn't negotiate, doesn't explain. She simply looks at Inanna with the look of death and speaks the word of wrath. Inanna dies. Her corpse is hung on a hook on the wall. Her body begins to rot. This is not symbolic death. The text describes decomposition. After 3 days, Inanna's body is green meat. She's truly dead. A god has died. The underworld's power nullified even Inanna's divinity. The ME she'd stolen from Enki, all the power she possessed in the upper world, couldn't protect her in Ker. Different rules applied there. Ninshubur, following Inanna's instructions, goes to Enlil and Nanna seeking help. Both refuse. They say Inanna transgressed by descending to Ker and must face the consequences. But Enki, always Enki helps. He creates 2 small beings from dirt beneath his fingernails, gives them the food of life and the water of life, and sends them into the underworld to rescue Inanna. These creatures succeed because they're not gods. They're constructs, barely alive beneath Ereshkigal's notice. They flatter her, sympathize with her suffering. The text reveals she's in constant agony, giving birth eternally to death itself, and in her distracted state, They apply the food and water of life to Inanna's corpse. Inanna revives, but she can't simply leave. The laws of Kur require a substitute. Someone must take her place. She returns to the upper world with demons following her, searching for a replacement. Eventually, she finds her husband Dumuzi sitting comfortably on a throne, not mourning her absence. Enraged, she decrees he will be her substitute. Dumuzi is dragged to the underworld. Later texts negotiate a compromise. Dumuzi and his sister Geshtinanna alternate 6-month terms in Kur, explaining the seasonal cycle. But the core message is clear. Kur's power is absolute within its boundaries. Even the great gods cannot override it. Ereshkigal's authority in the underworld exceeds Enlil's authority in heaven. She doesn't possess more Emi in absolute terms, but in her domain, her rules are supreme. This suggests the Emi weren't uniformly distributed across cosmic realms. Different zones operated under different power structures. The upper world, where Enlil reigned and Enki managed the Abzu, followed one set of protocols. Kur followed another. Why would reality be partitioned this way? If the Emi represented an actual energy system, regional divisions would make sense for the same reason. Electrical grids are divided into districts. Each zone has its own generator, its own distribution network, its own regulations. Power from one grid can't simply flow into another without interfaces, transformers, and compatibility protocols. Kur was isolated. The text described it as having 7 gates, not for symbolic reasons, but as actual barriers. Each gate was a checkpoint, a transition point, a place where power configurations changed. Passing through required abandoning the previous zone's rules and accepting the new zone's authority. Inanna tried to enter Kur while maintaining her upper world power configuration. The gates forced her to reconfigure. By the time she reached the throne room, she was compatible with Kur's power structure, which meant she was vulnerable to it. Ereshkigal didn't need to fight Inanna. She just needed to assert her authority within her own domain. Inanna, stripped of incompatible Emi, had no defense. The look of death and word of wrath that killed Inanna sound like command phrases, like authentication codes. Ereshkigal spoke words that activated Kur's fundamental power, and that power killed even a god. This is administrative authority, not brute force. Ereshkigal was the root administrator of the underworld system. Her commands executed with absolute priority. The food and water of life that revived Inanna came from Enki. The text doesn't explain what these substances were, but they worked even in Kur, suggesting they operated at a level beneath the zone-specific power structures. They were more fundamental than the Emi, targeting biological processes directly. Life and death themselves might exist at a deeper level than the power structures the gods managed. The Emi controlled civilization, consciousness, capabilities, but life, raw biological animation, could be manipulated with different tools. Enki possessed these tools. He kept them in the Abzu, and he used them to subvert Kur's absolute authority, not by challenging Ereshkigal directly, but by operating at a level she didn't control. The underworld texts reveal something crucial. The divine power structure wasn't monolithic. It was layered, zoned, partitioned. Different realms operated under different authorities. The Emi worked in some places, but not others. Power that seemed absolute in one realm became ineffective in another. This suggests the Anunnaki didn't create the cosmos. They managed it. They'd gained control of certain systems. The Abzu, the surface world, the temples, but other systems remained beyond their reach or under different management. Kur predated the current divine order. Ereshkigal's authority there wasn't granted by Enlil or Anu. It was indigenous to that realm. She might have been installed by elder powers as Kur's administrator, or she might have claimed authority when the current order was established, but her power wasn't derivative. It was absolute within its domain. This means humanity lived in a managed cosmos. The world wasn't random. It operated according to systems, protocols, and power structures. But those structures had seams, boundaries, places where one authority ended and another began. The gods knew these boundaries and navigated them carefully. Humans, lacking that knowledge, stumbled across boundaries accidentally and suffered consequences they couldn't understand, unless someone taught them, unless someone revealed how the systems worked, unless someone explained where power could be accessed, where it was forbidden, and how to distinguish between the two. That knowledge was itself an ME, and it was the most closely guarded of all, the forbidden transaction. Why didn't the gods give humans the ME? That's the question beneath every story we've examined. Enki possessed them in the Abzu. Inanna stole them for Uruk. Enlil wore the Tablet of Destinies. The power existed. The gods used it constantly. But humans had only restricted, mediated access through temples, rituals, and priestly hierarchies. The text offer an answer. Humans were created to serve. The Atrahasis epic is explicit about this. The gods made humans to perform labor the Igigi refused to do. Humans were tools. Biological robots designed for specific functions. Giving them full access to the ME would defeat the purpose of creating them. But this explanation only works if humans remain purely servants. The problem is that humans carried divine blood from their creation. Nintu mixed clay with god flesh and god blood. The resulting beings possessed Mu consciousness, intelligence, the capacity for independent thought. That divine spark meant humans could potentially use the ME if they gained access. They weren't biologically prevented. They were politically prevented, administratively prevented. The gods maintained a monopoly not because humans couldn't use divine power, but because they could. This makes the theft of ME by Inanna particularly significant. She stole them from Enki and brought them to Uruk, where humans lived and worked. The text says she distributed the ME throughout the city. It doesn't specify that she kept them for herself alone. The powers flowed into Uruk's infrastructure, its institutions, its people. After Inanna's theft, Uruk flourished. It became the greatest city of the early 3rd millennium BCE. Archaeological evidence confirms this. Uruk was enormous by ancient standards, possibly housing 50,000 people at its peak. Its architecture was monumental. Its administrative systems were sophisticated. Its cultural influence extended across Mesopotamia. Was this just because Uruk had a powerful patron goddess? Or because the city actually gained access to technologies and knowledge previously restricted to divine possession? The invention of writing appears at Uruk around 3200 BCE, shortly after the historical period the Inanna and Enki myth might reference. The earliest pictographic tablets come from Uruk. Their administrative records, counts of grain, beer, sheep, and temple goods, mundane content. But the technology is revolutionary. Writing is listed among the ME Inanna stole. The art of the scribe appears explicitly in the catalogue. If this ME represented not just the blessing of scribes, but the actual knowledge of how to write, the principles of encoding language into permanent visible form, then its transfer from Enki to Inanna and subsequently to Uruk would explain why writing appeared when and where it did. Not because humans independently invented it, but because divine knowledge was transferred to them through Inanna's theft. The same pattern might apply to other technologies. Metalworking, listed in the ME, becomes sophisticated in Uruk during this period. Agricultural techniques improve. Architecture advances. All the capabilities listed in the ME catalogue begin manifesting in the archaeological record at Uruk around the same time. Coincidence, or evidence that the myth preserves memory of actual technology transfer. If the latter, it explains why the gods were so concerned about restricting ME access. Every time humans gained more power, they approached divine capability. The boundary between god and human became harder to maintain. The flood myth encodes the ultimate expression of this concern. When humanity grew too numerous and too powerful, the gods decided to annihilate them. But this wasn't just about population control. The Atrahasis text says humans were disturbing. The gods, the word Rigmu, means not just noise, but organized discourse, assembly, coordination. Humans were acting collectively, thinking together, coordinating across large populations. They were using their divine mu for purposes beyond individual survival. They were building something. The gods saw this as a threat and responded with overwhelming force. After the flood, when kingship was re-established, it was lowered from heaven under much tighter controls. Kings were granted specific ME needed for governance, but not the full spectrum. Temples mediated between divine and human realms, with priests controlling access to rituals and power. The Abzu remained sealed, except to authorized personnel. The system was redesigned for stability, for safety, for divine security. But the knowledge didn't disappear entirely. Enki had ensured a human survived the flood. Ziusudra carried forward whatever knowledge he possessed. His descendants inherited it. Fragmentary, incomplete, but present. The priestly schools of Sumer preserved this knowledge in their cuneiform archives. They copied the old texts generation after generation, stories about gods, myths about creation, catalogues of divine powers. They maintained the memory. Modern scholars call these texts mythology, stories ancient people told to explain their world, symbolic narratives about imaginary beings. But what if the texts were documentary? What if the Sumerians were recording actual information about technologies and power sources they'd encountered? What if God was their word for beings who controlled these powers, and ME was their term for the powers themselves, and the stories about theft and transfer and restriction were simplified accounts of real events? The texts would still be hard to interpret. We'd be reading engineering manuals in metaphorical language, trying to extract technical specifications from religious poetry, but the information would be there. We'd have names: Enki, Enlil, Inanna, Ereshkigal, not gods, but roles, functions, administrators of different systems. We'd have locations: the Abzu, the Ekor, the Iana, Kur, not mythical places, but actual sites where power was concentrated, channeled or accessed. We'd have artifacts: the Tablet of Destinies, the ME themselves, the food and water of life, not magical objects, but devices or substances with specific functions. And we'd have procedures: the 7 gates of Kur, the 7 transfers from Enki to Inanna, the mixing of clay with divine blood, the descent to the Abzu, not rituals, but operational protocols. Reading the text this way doesn't prove they describe advanced technology, but it makes them coherent in ways the purely mythological reading struggles to explain. Why would the Sumerians describe divine power in such specific, material, transactional terms? Why would they consistently portray gods as dependent on external power sources rather than omnipotent? Why would they preserve impossible-seeming numbers in king lists unless those numbers meant something, unless they were trying to tell us something, trying to preserve information in the only format that would survive cultural collapse and linguistic extinction? Clay tablets pressed with cuneiform, myths copied by scribes who might not have understood what they were copying, stories that seemed like fantasies but contained embedded data about how their world actually worked. The Sumerians called them sacred texts. We call them mythology, but perhaps they're archives, encrypted documentation of a technological civilization we've misclassified as primitive because we can't recognize the technology they're describing. The ME might still exist. The Abzu might still hold them deep beneath the Iraqi desert where Eridu once stood. The Tablet of Destinies might be stored in some underground chamber, waiting for someone who knows how to activate it. Or perhaps the power itself degraded over millennia, leaving only stories behind. Memory without substance. Information without implementation. Either way, the text remains, preserved on clay that survives fire and flood, carrying information forward across 4,000 years, waiting for someone to read them, not as mythology, but as evidence. Evidence of what, exactly? That's the question that keeps archaeologists awake at night. That's the question the tablets themselves seem designed to answer, if only we knew how to ask correctly. What the tablets remember? Let's review what we actually know. The Sumerian texts exist. Over 100,000 cuneiform tablets have been excavated from ancient Mesopotamian sites. They're housed in museums across the world: the British Museum, the Louvre, the University of Pennsylvania Museum, the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, and dozens of other institutions. The tablets are real. The writing is readable. The translations are verifiable by anyone who studies Akkadian and Sumerian. These texts describe a concept called ME. The word appears in hundreds of contexts across religious, administrative, and literary documents. It refers to something the Sumerians considered fundamental to civilization and divine power. Scholars debate the exact meaning, but the word clearly denotes capabilities, powers, or principles that could be possessed, transferred, and controlled. The texts describe specific events: Inanna stealing Me from Enki, Anzu stealing the Tablet of Destinies from Enlil, Nintu mixing divine blood with clay to create humans, Enki distributing powers across the world, Inanna descending through 7 gates of the underworld. These narratives use concrete, procedural language, not vague mysticism, specific actions, specific objects, specific consequences. The texts also record data that seems impossible: kings ruling for tens of thousands of years before the flood, gradually decreasing reign lengths afterward, eventually reaching normal human lifespans by historically verified periods. And the texts describe technologies, writing, metalworking, architecture, agriculture as divine powers that were deliberately transferred to humanity rather than independently invented. This is what we know. The question is how to interpret it. Interpretation 1. Pure mythology. The mainstream scholarly view treats these texts as religious mythology. The Sumerians, like all pre-scientific cultures, explained their world through stories about supernatural beings. The gods are personifications of natural forces and social institutions. The ME represents abstract concepts of civilization. The impossible king list numbers are symbolic expressions of antiquity. The creation stories are theological statements about human purpose, not literal accounts. This interpretation is intellectually responsible. It doesn't make wild claims. It situates Sumerian culture within the broader pattern of human religious expression, but it struggles with certain details. Why is the language so specific? Why do the texts treat ME as physical enough to be stolen, counted, and transported? Why do multiple independent stories describe the same power transfer mechanics? Why preserve impossible numbers in otherwise documentary king lists? The mythological interpretation can answer these questions, but it requires treating each anomaly as separate. The specificity is just narrative style. The physical language is metaphorical. The consistency across texts reflects common cultural assumptions. The numbers are pure invention. Each explanation is plausible individually. Together, they feel incomplete. Interpretation 2. Encoded history. An alternative reading treats the texts as historical memory preserved in mythological language. Real events happened. Perhaps a catastrophic flood, perhaps political upheavals, perhaps technological changes, and were encoded in stories about gods because the Sumerians had no other framework for preserving information. Under this interpretation, Inanna stealing the ME might preserve memory of Uruk gaining cultural and technological superiority over Eridu through some historical process. The flood story encodes actual flooding events in Mesopotamia, which definitely occurred. Geological evidence confirms multiple major floods in the region's history. The creation myths preserve knowledge of earlier human populations or cultures. This interpretation accounts for the specificity and consistency of the texts, while avoiding claims of literal divine being. It treats the Sumerians as intelligent recorders of information working within cultural constraint, but it still leaves question. If the ME represent only abstract cultural knowledge, why the consistent emphasis on physical transfer? If the impossible king list numbers are just exaggerations of normal reign lengths, why preserve the specific figures, 28, 800 years, 36,000 years, rather than simply saying, a very long time? Interpretation 3. Technological documentation. The interpretation I've been exploring throughout this script treats the texts as documentation of actual technologies or energy sources described in the only language available to Bronze Age observers. The ME were real, not abstract principles, but actual capabilities that could be controlled, enhanced, or suppressed through some technology the Sumerians called divine power. The Abzu wasn't just a theological concept, but an actual facility, perhaps connected to geological features like aquifers and petroleum deposits, where this technology was housed. The temples, especially the ziggurats, were interface points designed to channel this power according to specific architectural principles. The gods were real beings, not supernatural entities, but beings with advanced knowledge who controlled these technologies and were perceived as divine by the humans they created or modified. The creation story in Atrahasis preserves memory of biological engineering, mixing clay-based genetic material with divine blood, enhanced genetic sequences to produce humans with consciousness but limited capabilities. The theft stories, Inanna from Enki, Anzu from Enlil, preserve memory of actual power transfers, perhaps political upheavals where control of key facilities changed hands. The flood destroyed infrastructure, causing the power system to degrade. Post-flood civilization rebuilt with less access to the original technology, leading to the progressive decline in human capabilities recorded in the king list. This interpretation accounts for the maximum number of textual details with the minimum number of special explanations. It treats the text as internally consistent documentation of phenomena the Sumerians actually observed, but it requires accepting extraordinary claims that advanced technology existed in the 4th millennium BCE, that biological engineering was possible, that the beings we call gods were something other than mythological constructs. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Do we have it? What would constitute evidence? If the technological interpretation is correct, we'd expect to find archaeological anomalies, artifacts, or architectural features that don't fit our understanding of Bronze Age capabilities. We have some candidates: the precision of ziggurat alignment, the sophisticated internal drainage systems, the enormous quantities of bitumen used in sacred construction, but nothing definitively beyond Bronze Age engineering. Consistent technical language across texts. If the ME were actual technologies, the description should be consistent and specific. And they are. The ME are always described as transferable, countable, and functional. They always produce observable effects. They're never purely spiritual or abstract in their operation. Biological anomalies in ancient human remains, if genetic engineering occurred as Atrahasis suggests, we might find genetic signatures. We don't. Ancient Mesopotamian DNA, when recoverable, shows normal human sequences, though this doesn't rule out technologies that worked with existing human genetics rather than creating novel sequences. Physical traces of the Abzu facility. If the Abzu was an actual installation beneath Eridu, archaeological excavation should find something beyond normal temple architecture. Excavations have found 18 layers of temples, built over 3,000 years, suggesting the spot held unusual significance, but nothing obviously technological. Independent corroboration from other cultures. If advanced beings interacted with early humans in Mesopotamia, they probably interacted with other cultures too. We'd expect parallel stories. And we have them. Egyptian texts about gods teaching civilization, Vedic accounts of the manas and divine weapons, Mesoamerican stories of gods bringing knowledge, but these could also be independent mythological developments. So the evidence is suggestive, but not conclusive. The texts are consistent with the technological interpretation. The archaeology doesn't contradict it, but neither does the evidence force us to that conclusion. We're left with a choice about which interpretation best accounts for what we observe, and that choice depends partly on our assumptions about what's possible. The probability question: how likely is it that Bronze Age Mesopotamia possessed advanced technology? If we assume technological progress is strictly linear, that societies advance gradually from primitive to sophisticated, then it's virtually impossible. The Sumerians were early. They couldn't have had advanced technology because they didn't have the accumulated knowledge base. But technological progress isn't necessarily linear. Civilizations rise and fall. Knowledge can be lost. The Library of Alexandria burned. The Roman concrete formula was forgotten for 1,000 years. The Antikythera mechanism, a sophisticated Greek astronomical computer from the 2nd century BCE, was so advanced that when it was discovered in a shipwreck in 1901, scholars initially thought it was a modern contamination because no one believed ancient Greeks could build such devices. If one technology could be lost and rediscovered, others could be too. If the Sumerians inherited knowledge from an earlier culture, either human or other, they might have possessed capabilities that seem anachronistic. The alternative is that they invented everything themselves in a burst of creative genius between 4000 and 3000 BCE. In 1 millennium, humans went from Neolithic villages to sophisticated cities with writing, mathematics, astronomy, architecture, metallurgy, law codes, and complex religious institutions. Either scenario, inheritance or invention, requires explaining an extraordinary rate of development. The technological interpretation offers one possible explanation: they had help. They received knowledge from the beings they called Anunnaki. But this raises more questions than it answers. Where did the Anunnaki come from? What was their nature? Why did they create or modify humans? Where did they go? The texts don't provide clear answers. The gods eventually withdrew. The direct presence ended. Whether they died, left, or simply became inaccessible as their technology failed, the result was the same. Humans were left alone with fragmentary knowledge, clay tablets preserving stories they no longer fully understood. What we're left with 4,000 years after the last cuneiform tablets were pressed into wet clay, we have the texts. We have the ruins. We have the questions. We don't have definitive answers. The ME might have been advanced technology, or sophisticated social systems, or pure theological concepts. The text can support any interpretation, depending on our assumption. What's not debatable is that the Sumerians themselves believed the ME were real, important, and dangerous. They devoted enormous resources to temples and rituals designed to access or appease these powers. They structured their entire civilization around relationship to the divine. They preserved detailed information about this relationship in thousands of tablets. They were trying to tell us something, trying to preserve knowledge they considered crucial. Whether that knowledge is literal truth, encoded history, or sophisticated mythology, it survived. The tablets remain. The questions remain. And somewhere beneath the Iraqi desert, where Eridu once stood at the edge of the world, the foundations of the Iabzu still exist, buried under millennia of sand. If the ME were real, they might still be there, dormant, waiting. The energy. You're listening to this in darkness, perhaps, or in the half-light of a screen, your consciousness poised between waking and sleep, open to ideas that daylight logic might dismiss. Let's return to where we began, the Louvre basement, the Gudea cylinder, clay pressed with cuneiform 4,000 years ago, describing power transferred from God to human. divine forces flowing through a temple, making stone and brick come alive with energy. You can visit that cylinder if you're ever in Paris. Request access to the storage areas. They'll let serious researchers in if you make arrangements. You can see the artifact with your own eyes, read the inscription, touch the glass case that separates you from 4 millennia of human wandering. Or you can visit Yer. The ziggurat still stands, partially reconstructed, dominating the desert landscape. You can climb the stairs if you're allowed, security conditions in southern Iraq permitting. You can stand where priests stood, looking out over lands that once held millions of people, organized into the world's first civilization. The structures are real, the texts are real, the questions are real. What's harder to grasp is what it means if the answers are real too. If the ME existed, if some form of energy or technology powered early civilization, then our understanding of history is fundamentally wrong. Not wrong about dates or kings or battles. Wrong about the trajectory of human development. Wrong about what's possible. Wrong about where we came from and what we lost. That's uncomfortable. It destabilizes assumptions. It suggests that progress isn't linear, that knowledge can be forgotten, that our ancestors might have understood things we've only begun to rediscover. It suggests we're not the pinnacle of human achievement, but rather a point on a cycle that has risen and fallen before. The Sumerian king list records this cycle. Immense longevity and capability before the flood, reduced but still superhuman abilities afterward. Gradual decline to normal human limits. By the time the texts were written down in their final form, the scribes were recording memories of a time when humans were more than they currently were. Those scribes didn't consider themselves primitive. They saw themselves as inheritors of a diminished but still glorious tradition. They preserved the old knowledge even when they no longer fully understood it, hoping future generations might recover what had been lost. We are those future generations. We have their texts. We have tools. They didn't. Radiocarbon dating, satellite archaeology, DNA analysis, electromagnetic sensors, ground-penetrating radar. We can investigate the ruins they couldn't reach. We can ask questions they couldn't formulate. But we lack something they had. Direct continuity with the tradition. The chain of transmission broke, the priestly schools closed, the languages died, the techniques were lost. We're archaeologists of our own heritage, excavating the foundations of civilization, finding evidence that doesn't fit our models, trying to reconcile what we know intellectually with what the texts actually say. The choice before us is epistemological. Do we trust our theories about what's possible, or do we trust what ancient sources explicitly describe? Both approaches have merit. Theories protect us from credulity, from accepting wild claims without evidence. But theories can also blind us, making us unable to see what contradicts them. The perfect approach would balance both: rigorous skepticism about extraordinary claims combined with genuine openness to evidence that challenges assumptions. The tablets challenge our assumption. They describe power as something transferable, material, and controllable. They describe gods as dependent on external sources for their capabilities. They describe humans as engineered beings, designed for servitude but containing divine potential. They describe a catastrophe that reset civilization, requiring humanity to rebuild from diminished capacity. If even half of this is literally true, our picture of prehistory is incomplete. If it's all metaphorical, we're still left with the question, why this particular metaphor? Why frame theological ideas in such consistently material, technological language? The answer might be waiting in unexplored ruin, in unexcavated tells beneath Iraqi sand, in tablets still buried in ancient libraries, in temple foundations that haven't been fully mapped. Or the answer might be encoded in the texts we already have, waiting for someone to read them with fresh eyes, without preconceptions, willing to consider possibilities that seem impossible. The ME, if they existed, haven't been destroyed. Energy doesn't disappear. It changes form. Knowledge can be lost, but also recovered. Technologies can be dormant for millennia, then reactivated when the right key is found. Perhaps the Sumerians left us that key, pressed it into clay, wrote it in a language that had to be painstakingly deciphered. encoded it in stories about gods and monsters and cosmic battles. Perhaps the texts are waiting for someone to read them, not as ancient mythology, but as operational manuals for accessing power that never actually left. That's still there, beneath the earth, in the waters, in the electromagnetic spectrum, in configurations of matter and energy we don't yet recognize as technology. The Abzu still exists as a geological feature. Underground aquifers are still there beneath southern Iraq. The ziggurats still exist as ruins, their geometry and proportions intact, even if their facing bricks have crumbled. The texts still exist, thousands of them, preserved on clay that survives almost anything. All the pieces remain. The question is whether anyone will assemble them, whether anyone will read the instructions the Sumerians left, whether anyone will take seriously the possibility that these Bronze Age scribes were documenting reality, not inventing fantasy. You've heard the evidence now. The tablets describing transferable divine powers, the creation story involving biological mixing, the king list recording impossible lifespans, the architectural precision of ziggurats, the consistency of the mythology across 1,000 years, the procedural language describing how power moves from being to being, place to place, realm to realm. You've heard mainstream interpretations and alternatives. You've seen how the text can be read multiple ways depending on assumptions. Now you decide. Is it mythology, sophisticated theology from gifted ancient thinkers explaining their world through stories about gods? Is it encoded history, real events preserved in symbolic language because Bronze Age cultures had no other way to record information? Or is it documentation, technical descriptions of actual technologies and power sources, described by observers who didn't understand the principles but accurately recorded the effects? The choice is yours. The tablets don't insist. They just sit in their museums, patient, waiting for someone to understand what they're saying. Perhaps that someone is already working in an archive, translating a fragment that will make everything clear. Perhaps that someone hasn't been born yet. Perhaps that someone is you, listening to this now, feeling something shift in your understanding, recognizing that the questions matter, even if the answers remain uncertain. The Sumerians invested everything, their resources, their architecture, their society, in relationship to the power they called ME. They believed it was real enough to build ziggurats for, real enough to preserve in thousands of tablets, real enough to structure their entire civilization around. Were they wrong, deluded, or did they know something we've forgotten? The energy they described might still be waiting in the Abzu depths, in temple geometries, in the texts themselves, encoded in cuneiform wedges pressed into clay when the world was young, waiting for someone to remember, to recognize, to activate what has always been there, just beyond the reach of minds that stopped believing such power could exist. The tablets remember. Even if we've forgotten, the tablets remember, and they're waiting for us to remember too.